Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, Professor. My name is Jorge Daniel Rosales, and I would like to discuss today a little bit about English variation, especially from my country, Honduras. We will go through English variation in Bay Island, a series of islands in the north side from Honduras, which English is basically the first language, not the second language. We know that Honduran language is Spanish as a mother tongue. But in the case of Bay Island, the first language is English. And also, it's interesting to know that it's basically a variation from English. So today, we will discuss a little bit about that and how this language is connected with some other island from the Caribbean. I would like to share with you a presentation that is called Bay Island Creole English, Guanaja, Roatan, and Utila English. As you can see, we have pictures from Bay Island and all the main islands from the north side of Honduras. We will go through historical aspects of what happened in these islands, and in order to understand how language was developed and how language was created, we need to understand the historical background of English, or historical background of from these islands. Let's begin by showing you the index. We will talk about, as I said, the historical background, aspects in language, Bay Island English classification, grammatical items, lexical items, syntactical items, sociolinguistics, phonetics, examples, videos, and references as well. In order to understand how the language is connected with, in this case, Great Britain or England, in other words, this is a British colonial flag. This British colonial flag is still used in Bay Island from Honduras. This is a historical Bay Island flag. It is still used as an unofficial symbol of the island. The flag was also used by the governor British from Honduras. So as you can see, English is a variation in this island. Let's talk a little bit about the historical aspects. We need to understand what are the settlers from Roatan. They were believed to be Payas, which is an indigenous group in the mainland from Honduras. And they arrived there in 600 before Christ, or AD. By the time of Christopher Columbus arrived, the fourth voyage in 1502 and 1504 to the neighboring island of Guanaja, the inhabitants were thought to have been capable sailors and merchants. So once we have the indigenous Payas, and then we have sailors or merchants that were trading, right, with people from far away, as Mexico and Jamaica. Then we move on to Europeans that arrived. They began riding Roatan for slaves, an act that brought the most ruthless killers to the island inhabitants. So not only visitors, but also slaves, and also we're talking about pirates that came to this place, you see. So all of this came from Europe, and most of them were from European countries where where English language was spoken. Between the 1500s and the 1700s, as the British and the Spanish wrestled for the control of the Caribbean. You see the British and the Spanish trying to control the Caribbean, right? Here we have it, and Bay Island map, as you can see. Then we move on to some more historical aspects. What happened with this? Over the time, Bay Island became an ever-changing array of settlers, traders, even pirates, as I was saying, privateers, and military forces. It's estimated that there were nearly 500 pirates living in Roatan in the mid 1700s. In 1797, the English forced about 500 black Caribs from the island to Saint Vincent, moving them from island to island and finally leaving them on Roatan. The Black Carib or Caribbean descendants from Arawak, indigenous of African Maroons, remain in Punta Gorda, Roatan's first permanent post-colonial settlement, and form the genesis of today Garifuna culture, celebrated on the island with a festival every April. So, slaves that came from many places, from Saint Vincent, for example, or from African countries as well, settled down in this series of islands that we know now as Bay Island. Let's talk a little bit about the aspects of the language. What happened with the aspect of the language? Bay Island is an English variety spoken on the Bay Island Department, okay, from Honduras. The Ethnologue reported that there were 22,500 native speakers in the 2001. We're talking about English native speakers. Mainlanders know this language as the Caracol, which is literally mean conch. Genealogically, this variety descends from the Cayman Island English. The island had an ever revolving door to settlers and guests, from the original indigenous people to the Spanish, English, and African Caribbean. Today, Roatan culture could be described as one of the most colorful, diverse from the Western Hemisphere. Then we move on a little bit about more from the aspects of the language. Though technically parts of Honduras whose official language is Spanish, yes, as I explained before, the official language from Honduras is Spanish. Well, most of Roatan's native inhabitants' first language is English. A holdover from the days when the British Crown claimed the island on pirates and privateers were plentiful in Roatan. Over the time, there was an act, yes, where the British Crown was controlling. The British Crown controlled all the what we know now as Bay Island, all the island from the north side from Honduras. So after a time, the British Crown gave all the islands to the Honduran government. Today, you'll find a number of these islands estimated at 55,000 locals speaking English, Spanish, and a few Honduras indigenous languages, as well as the people speaking languages from all over the world: French, Canadian, German, Italian, and Pidgin. So you see, most of the speakers in Bay Island are from English, but not English, but a variation of English. Then we move on to Bay Island English classifications. Based on the classification of Cratius and Mayer's model, we will discuss a little bit about these two models. Mayer's model, Bay Island's English is classified as part of the outer circle. Now, for Cratius' model, we have the inner circle, the outer circle, and some other circle that I don't remember right now. I think this this Cratius model is basically what he explains here is that in the outer circle, the language is not a native language variety. It's just a native language, non-native, variety of English because of its colonial history. In this area, in this circle, in the Cratius model, we move on. We can talk about the Bay Island English. Why? Because of the colonial history that that this English has. And we know that this type of English, which is a Creole English we will discuss later on, the Creole English is non-native variety from English. Yes. And then, and on the other hand, we have the peripheral non-standard variety for Mayer's model. In the case of Mayer's model, for Mayer's, the Bay Island English classification is basically a peripheral non-standard variety. Why? Because of English is a colonial variety called Creole English. This is what I was telling you about, Creole English. So since Creole English is a non-standard variety in the Mayer's model, English is just a variety that is not part of the Mayer language itself. And it's actually non-standard variety because we have standard varieties, for example, Great Britain, to another standard variety, which is American English, right? Or Canadian English, and so on. But this one becomes a non-standard variety. Okay. Now, moving on with this. What is Creole English? Creole English is basically an stable natural language that has developed from a simplified version of a language. It has its origins in African slaves after the conquest of America, brought to the Caribbean plantation of indigenous population in regions of South America, for example, Oceania and Africa, were forced to use the language of the colonial power. In this case, it was English. This is what we a variation called Creole English, in which Bay Island take part into. What about the grammatical items that we can use? This is a picture of the first Bay Island English grammar work manual. Actually, they have manual to work their English. It's in its most extreme form, the Caribbean Creole and Bay Island English can appear unintelligible to all outsiders, as with dialects that are fine shades of different between speakers. Although there are a number of elements that characterize most of the form of the Caribbean English. The lack of the verb to be, for example, in the statement, she dreaming. This is a phrase that they use a lot. In the standard English requires, for example, it would be, she is dreaming. This is the typical of the type of a structure that occurs in a Creole. Him tell me that yesterday. This is a variation of English, an example of a variation. He told me that yesterday. So as you can see, there is a clear connection between the variation, which is a non-standard variation, to a standard or a standard English. Moving on with the lexical and the syntax items. Talking about the lexical, which is the vocabulary, as a second language, the lexical is very distorted and simplified than the language imposed. The meaning is always clear despite the simplification of the language. What happened with the simplification of the language? Basically, they tried to simplify everything. Yes, as the example that I previously gave you, him tell me that, as you can see, the word that is a simplification of it. So words try to be simple and short, okay? And the syntax keep its own syntax of indigenous languages. The children and the descendants of the speakers refine this, reduce to transform it into a more efficient language. They created the variation, and they transform it into a more efficient language. This is the syntax that they use. Short language, reduce forms to transform it into efficient language. What about the social linguistics? Well, after 10 years of negotiation, primarily by the Native Bay Island Professional Laborers Association, progress has been made in the development of the cultural bilingual education program for the Bay Islands, and increased special training for education and health workers. This points to the growing official acceptance by all levels of government in Honduras of the multicultural and plurilinguistic nature of Honduran society and the right of ethnic group to preserve their identity. So a lot of works have been made in order to negotiate for professionalism, on the language, to try to increase the bilingual education, special training for education, using their multicultural aspects and the plurilinguistic nature of their language. Also talking about respecting the ethnic groups to preserve their identity, to understand that they are from Honduras and they are from Bay Island, and that the language is important as well. So we will now, here we have an phonetics, as you can see. This is Haitian Creole alphabet. But as I said, Caribbean languages or Creole came from most of Caribbean languages, since they came from slave, that came from other countries, especially from Africa. So they share the same alphabet, as you can see, which is not the same. ML is different. This is a variation in phonetics. I'm not going to explain each one of them because it's a little bit complicated. But as you can see, there exists a variation between one language to the other. Here is another example of this. Meaning this one means slow down, children, I play in here. The literal translation is lift your foot from the accelerator. There are small people playing here, which is, as you can see, a variation or a writing variation of this. Here is another example of how they use the Bay Island English. Now I would just give you a short presentation of Happy Harry, which is a YouTuber who
what they call Island English here on Roatan.
uses the English from Bay Island. Now you will see an example of how they use it. Pronunciation and phonetics is different, as you can see.
It's okay, bro. Go ahead.
And we are about to show you guys about the Honduras English.
Right on. Who are you?
My name is Nathan, and we're about to show you about Honduras English.
Right on. You?
Tyrell Bennett. My name is Tyrell Bennett.
Right on. You
My name is Seamus Paul. Welcome.
Okay.
My name is Blake Collins.
Okay. Let's hear what you guys got. You know.
As you can see, they are using the language, a variation of English.
What do you guys do today?
We have band start with girls and
Walk around. Walk the whole beach end to end.
how to get to
End to end, go walk in there. This end to the other end, every end.
English boy.
We live this up.
And when you all link up today, what time you link up?
About 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
I linked up 7.
7, huh?
Me 6.
Okay. And what about the fishing tournament? You go to that kind of?
It's 6. Variation, right?
What you do?
Huh?
What'd you do?
A party.
Yeah.
Yeah. You gonna look at the camera, man?
She showed the one, see what we could show you. Come, girl.
Come on.
That's a real thing, that.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful
You
black
want to
girl.
introduce yourself?
Come, girl. Hey, you wild, bro. Right, come. But I look at the picture.
What else? Okay, what else can you tell me? What's your
Every
name?
walk down to us.
Okay, I'll tell you something right now, man.
All right, we will stop here because we don't have a little bit of time. But this is a clear explanation. You can see because I will attach this presentation so that you can take a look of it. Then we move on to the references. Okay. Well, in order to understand, as I said, our language, we need to understand the history that we've been going through, and Honduras has its own history, I am very happy to have this multicultural environment in which I go through. I live in the southern part from Honduras, but I find this very, very interesting. This will be my own presentation, and thank you very much.